Shalom Aleichem. Today is Yom Hamishi b'Shabbat, Thursday, Daled b'Heshwan Tavshin Peheh, Leminyanenu, the 5th of December 2024, Leminyan Ha'omoth. And we are in Mishneh Torah Rambam, Perek Toif, Hilchot Avoda Zarah, Perek Toif, Halachayot Toif, at the end of the Perek. Rambam says, Ha'olachim letharputh, or latarputh, which is a reference to to Beth Avoda Zarah, to some kind of religious shrine, Shilo Goyim. Tarputh, Turpa, is always, in such contexts, always a reference to Inyane Avoda Zarah, which are always considered and connected to Tuma'ah, and everything that is negative and evil in the world, as we've discussed many times. So those going to, and we'll see in a moment, this could be a Jew or a non-Jew, those going to such a place, apparently this would be on some festive day, or leading up to such a day, and there's some place, some shrine, some temple where people gather, and there's always Avodah Zarah there, and there's also some kind of marketplace there. Let's say it's a place where people go and they spend a day or two, so they camp out, so they have some kind of camping ground, shall we say, and there's a market where you can buy provisions, etc. Asur laseth v'lateth imahen. It is asur to do any business, to engage in any commercial activity with people who are going to such a place. For the same reason, as we saw at the beginning of this, you should be able now to see the beginning of the Perek, okay? So at the beginning of the Perek, we learned, Shalosha yomim lifnei edehem shel goyim. So this is not referring to a place, but a time. 3 days before such a festive occasion, asur likach mehem ulimkor lahem davar hamitkayim. We do not buy or purchase from them, we do not sell to them. And this is because this will, anything which involves gain, profit, for this Avodah Zarah, for this, which normally one hopes we're talking about a Gentile, not about a Jew. But as we'll see in a moment, that it is also possible we're talking about Yisrael Meshumad, Lo Alenu. So if we're talking about Yisrael Meshumad, someone who has turned their back on the Torah, a Jew who has forsaken the Torah, Has v'Shalom, then he has the same status, same halachic status, and the same halachot apply to him the same way. So there it would cause them to rejoice, to be pleased, to thank their Avodah Zarah, etc., etc. In the same way, we do not do this with regards to a person going to what we call tarputh, in other words, place of Avodah Zarah, for the same reason. Bar-Hayim mutarim. Those who are returning, in other words, those who have gone, so usually we're talking here about a Gentile, those who have been at such a place, and they've finished whatever activity they were involved in over there, and now they're going home, and now they're on the road. You are allowed to transact with them, mutarim, because now that event is over, so it's not going to cause them to rejoice more or to thank their Avodah Zarah or whatever it is. And you also will not be in any way facilitating or participating in these activities. So it is mutar to transact with them on their way back. We're talking about a situation well, you do not have a caravan. Sometimes these people traveled in groups, and they would have, let's say, donkeys or horses or camels or what have you, tied together, kishurim. It could be, for example, there was a bunch of merchants, traders, who went to such a place in order to set up a stall there and sell their wares, etc., their merchandise. Perhaps they will change their mind and turn back. Why might that be the case? They may have heard that initially this festivity was supposed to last 1 day or 2 days, and the local governor or the local priest or whatever it was decided that it should be now 3 days. Everyone's having such a great time. Let's do it for another day. So they may hear this and may go back. So if they're still, as it were, in business mode, that's what it means. Shimayu kashurim. If they're still in business mode, they're still a caravan. They can still return and do what they did before. Then we still do not transact with them for the same reason. So again, this would normally involve a non-Jew. However, if there's a Jew going to this place, why would he be going to this place? We're not talking about Yisrael Meshumah here yet. We're talking about Israel. But he apparently is going there to do business, to transact, to set up a stall, as we just explained. He has a financial reason for being there, not a religious reason. He's on his way to this place because he sells something that these goyim will be interested in purchasing from him. And at this point, there are no Avoda Zarah related funds in his possession, or items or products. So when he's on his way to there, you're allowed to do business with him. Shema Hazobro, he may change his mind, he may do teshuvah and realize he shouldn't be going to this place. And he may not end up doing any transactions with these of the Avodah Zarah, and you therefore will not be involved or facilitating anything. And therefore, the possibility, Shema Yahzor is sufficient, because he has a Hezkat Kashrut, he's a Yisrael. Israel, we assume, if we're talking about a Jew that we generally know to be a Jew who lives according to the Torah, we're not talking about a Sadiq Yisod Olam, necessarily. No one is perfect, but the assumption is a normal Israel, that we know him to be one of the Jewish people who keep Shabbat, who study Torah, who generally live according to the Torah, even though they may slip up on occasion, as most people do, for various reasons, but it's not because of an ideology. He's not a Yisrael Meshumah, as we're about to read in a moment. He's Israel. It may be that for reasons of ta'awah, for reasons of Yasar Hara, for financial reasons, what have you, he may be doing something which is asur, or planning to do something which is asur, but he also may change his mind. Some Jew may see him and say, what are you doing? You can't go to that place, don't you know that? And he may be embarrassed and he may turn back. That is the assumption. So therefore you're allowed to do business with him. Uva hazira asur, but if he's already been there and you realize that he's been there, based on the direction of his travel, basically, and you understand that he has been into these places and now he is returning, going home, shall we say, and you know that he's been at such a place, well, he certainly has now in his possession money and or merchandise that he bought or sold at this place. And therefore, it's asur. You're not allowed to transact with him at all. So all of this has to do with the Israel who is doing something wrong, asur, but he's Israel, and therefore has a certain hazaqah, and he may yet change his mind. So with regards to such a person, it is reasonable and correct to give him the benefit of the doubt. It's can be connected to the Mishneh, he still has a certain Hezkat Kashrut. However, Yisrael Meshumad, a Jew that we know, unfortunately, Le'avon libeno, we know him not to be Yisrael kasher bichlal. He's Meshumad. We know that he's Mahalel Shabbat b'fer Hesya lo alano, and we know that he who ochel davar aher, he eats forbidden food, substances, and in general he has turned his back on Hashem and the Torah. Hashem Yishmor. Yisrael Meshumad, ben bahalicha, ben bahazira, asur. Because if he's going to this place, this tarputh, this Beit Avoda Zarah, then he has with him merchandise or monies which are connected to what he's planning to do there, to see there. And therefore it's asur to transact with him at all, as we said. Ben bahalicha, ben bahazira. It doesn't make a difference in which direction, coming or going, it's asur. In the same way that it's asur to engage in any business activity with a non-Jew, shlosha yomim lifnei edehem, as we discussed. So what we see from this halacha is very important, very very interesting, and very important. Yisrael, who is known to be a Yisrael kasher, generally speaking, even though he may slip up, and usually for reasons of yetzer hara or financial gain or other types of weakness, he may engage in things that are asur. He is nevertheless Yisrael afal pi shehata Yisrael hu. This is very important. What the Talmud states in Masechet Kiddushin: Yisrael shehata afal pi shehata Yisrael afal pi shehata Yisrael hu is a very important statement. But it is frequently misquoted and misunderstood. There are people today, many people, including, unfortunately, many people who should know much better, who quote that statement of the Chachamim, Yisrael afal pi shehata Yisrael hu, in order to claim that every type of meshumad today has a din of Yisrael. If that were the case, there would be no such distinction made here in this halacha, which of course is not Rambam's hidush, invention. It is based on explicit statements of Chazal. These halachot of Chazal distinguish between a Yisrael who is hoteh. Obviously we're talking about Yisrael shehata or med lahato, and yet he has a heskat kashrut, and still, because we know him generally to be a good Jew, and Shema Yahazorbo, he may still change his mind. He may not do this thing that you suspect that he's doing. But Yisrael Meshumad, someone that you know to be ideologically opposed to the Torah, not because he's necessarily some great philosopher or intellectual, and he's written books about why he doesn't believe in the Torah, Has v'Shalom, or something like that. Not because of that. Because we see his lifestyle. We see what he says. We see how he lives. We understand that he is not a Yisrael kasher. This is clear. Now, it doesn't matter right now whether he's another statement that people often inject into such discussions incorrectly, misguidedly, mistakenly, is the concept of a tinok or mishahu kathinok shenishba. It makes no difference if he was brought up this way or not brought up this way. It makes a difference in terms of his culpability, up to a point at least. It makes a difference in terms of how much effort we should invest in trying to speak to him and instruct him as to how he should be behaving, what he should be doing, what he should not be doing. There's a difference between Yisrael Meshumad, Shehu Katinok Shenishba, because he was brought up in such a home, in such a community, he doesn't know otherwise, or he's been told that there are other people who say something else, but they're all crazies, they're fanatics, they they're primitive, what have you. You don't have to pay any attention to them. He's still he can still be considered a kathinok shenishba, like as it were a babe that was captured and taken captive by goyim and brought up as a goy. It makes no difference if he was such a person, or he literally or figuratively. That's the tinok shenishba is someone who is literally taken captive. Kathinok shenishba, which is a hidush of Rambam in Hilchot Mamrim, which does not appear in Chazal at all. Kathinok shenishba is comparing it figuratively to that concept. But Yisrael Meshumar is a reality. This person is such a person. You know him to be someone who goes to these places of tarput, of Avoda, Zarah, or other forms of abomination. And therefore, there's no reasonable possibility. It's extremely far-fetched, to put it mildly, that he would be hozerbo, that he will change his mind. Because he has no hezkath kashrut, he has hazakah of being quite the opposite. And therefore, ben v'halicha, ben v'hazira, asur. Therefore, we see from this halakha, these halachot, we see something very clear. We should not accept claims made by certain people, again, people often who should know better, with regards to Yisraeli Meshumadim, that, once he said this or he did that, or what have you, saw him do X, Y, or Z, but maybe he did teshuvah in the meantime. That is a ridiculous statement, because it is totally unreasonable. It is not in consonance with reality, with what a normal human being expects to encounter in the real world. And the halakha is not based on fantasies and fairy tales or Alice in Wonderland hopes and concepts. The halakha is based on reality. So a person who is known to be, unfortunately, a meshumad, we assume that which you would assume with regards to such a person, that is still the person they are, unless you know otherwise. If it is possible that Yisrael Meshumat will do teshuvah, yes, but then, even then, anahnu hoshadim bo, as we've discussed before, we don't necessarily accept his change of heart at face value, certainly not immediately. He would have to prove himself, and that may take a very long time. So we see here clearly the difference between the Yisrael, who is not acting according to the Torah in this particular instance, who still has the status of a Yisrael, and therefore a certain hezkath kashrut, and therefore shemay hazorbo, as opposed to Yisrael Meshumat, who has the same has the same status, and even sometimes worse than Goyim over there Avoda Zarah. In this case, we see it's even worse, because here the Yisrael Meshumat ben ba'alicha ben ba'hazira, and with regards to the Goyim harochim letarput, the assumption there is we're talking about Gentiles. Asura, those who are going, it is asura. Habayim utarim. So, in some situations, a Yisrael Meshumat is considered more hamur than a non-Jew.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Regarding the Mishumad as you describe him, you are including any Jew who is seen to regularly violate basic halachot such as Shabbat, regardless of of his any public pronouncements?
Could you be more specific?
In other words, are we talking about? I apologize if I missed something. Are we talking about any situation where a Jew is basically non-observant, and even if he has no Jewish education, and so long as he's not observing halakha in general, as opposed to somebody who who messed up on a certain mitzvah once in a while. So, in other words,
No,
somebody who's
no, no, we're
basically
not. No, we're
a
not.
Sabbath
No, we're not.
desecrator.
No, we are not talking about someone who occasionally slips up or acts incorrectly, even if it's deliberate, not entirely by mistake. We're not talking about that.
No, that I know. I'm asking whether any Sabbath desecrator would basically fit into this category,
The
even if he
general
has no knowledge of what Shabbat is.
a person who has no knowledge of what the Torah says about Shabbat, if that's really the case, which is possible, there are such Jews, unfortunately. They've never really heard or seen anything to do with Shabbat, and they barely even know the concept. Maybe they never even heard of it. Such a person is lichora kathinok shenishba, and you could make certain allowances for such a person. But Yisrael Meshumad, first and foremost, is someone who's ideologically and in reality he acts out his ideology or his belief system. Because again, it doesn't have to be a great intellectual who can write a 1,000-page tome about why he believes in Yeshua HaNosri Shem Roshem Yirka or something like that. It doesn't have to be such a person. It can be any Shimon Reuven who lost his way, and the assumption also is that Yisrael Mushumad, the assumption is that he changed course at some point in his life. He was Israel and he became Yisrael Mushumad. He made a decision. And Rambam does not enter into the possibility that he mentions in Hilchot Mamrim about being brought up in that system by his parents, seeing that other people in his community behave not like Jews but like Gentiles. The Rambam is not entertaining that possibility here.
Well, but basically, I'm asking. Let's say, for the sake of argument, we know that the level of familiarity with Judaism is greater on average in Israel than it is in, let's say, America. But for the
Yes.
average let's take America for example. The average American Jew might have heard of what Shabbat is, but has very little knowledge of beyond very general familiarity. So the question is, how do we categorize these average type of
All right.
Jews?
So your question is not related to this specific halacha. Your question is related to what Rambam writes in the Chot Mamrim, which is who is included in this concept of so and so who is a kathinok, like to be compared to a tinok shenishba, a babe who was captured by goyim and brought up amongst them. The classic situation of a tinok shenishba is literally someone who was captured as a babe, did not know even that he was Jewish until, let's say, when he turned 30, he discovered that he had been taken captive from the Jews. So really he's a Jew. He didn't even know about that fact, and perhaps never doesn't have the vaguest idea what Jews do or do not do. That is a classic tinok shenishba, mamash, literally. Katinok shenishba is someone who's figuratively in the same position, because he may know technically that he's Jewish, but he was brought up to think that the Torah is not to be taken seriously. Lo aleno. It just doesn't apply. It's not binding, and maybe worse than that. It's silly. It's primitive. It's only weird people take it seriously, or something like that. Has shalom, and therefore you can compare such a person definitely to a tinok shenishba. That's what Rambam's chidush is. It is a chidush, but it's Rambam's chidush, which we should take seriously in Hilchot Mamrim. Obviously, these things can vary from person to person, from community to community. So we cannot give any one answer that fits all cases here. The point that we have to understand from these halachot is that with regards to a person who is generally Israel, who sometimes is over averoth, then he is a Yisrael afal pishe hatta Yisrael hu. And therefore he still has a Heskat Kashrut Shemei Ahzor Bo. And that is also why such a person, his Kiddushim are Kiddushim, and his Get is a Get, etc. Because he still has the halachic status of a Jew. He's a sinful Jew, maybe even on a regular basis, but he's still a Jew. He is part of Am Yisrael, and he wishes to be part of Am Yisrael, and he has not turned his back on the Torah, but mal asot, he has a real penchant and weakness for a ham sandwich with cheese every Tuesday for lunch. That's what he likes to do, and no one's going to tell him otherwise. So he's obviously not a Yisrael kasher mamash, but he's still a Yisrael, and therefore fal pishe hatta Yisrael, and that is correct, and that's what this halacha refers to. Yisrael meshumad is someone with regards to whom you have no reason to make any positive assumption about them, because you see the reality and you know the reality, and we don't assume that he's going to change his mind, and we don't assume that if you saw him going to Tarputh last week that he won't do it again this week. Shemei Ahzor Bo. There's no such assumption, there's no such hazakah, there's no such svara, and therefore we have to understand from these halachot how we should approach, what our attitude should be towards Jews who clearly, let us take a clear and unambiguous example. Someone who we know is part of a movement or part of a group. It could be a political party, it could be some kind of association, whatever it is, that fights against anything Jewish, shall we say, here in Israel, in the public domain, and even not in the public domain. Such a person is clearly Yisrael Meshumad and is invested ideologically and emotionally in such a path, in such an approach, such a way of life. And that person is to be treated as such, as a Yisrael Meshumad, who for almost all purposes has the same status as a goy, and sometimes worse than a stam goy, because with regards to with regards to a Yisrael Meshumad, we assume that anything he does, he has the wrong intention. So when it comes to Yisrael Meshumad, who does shehita, for example, as shehitato, he's considered a min, and therefore his shehita is an avela, because he's someone who acts upon a certain system of values and ideas and ideology to which he subscribes. Whereas Hazal say in the Bavli, in Masechet Hulin, with regards to Stam Goyim Shebechutz Haaretz, Sheminhag Avotehem B'Yadehem. In other words, they worship Avodah Zarah, etc., but they're not necessarily so staunch in their beliefs, and therefore they're not really mahader to have a kawana, whether it comes to shehita, for example, that it should be l'shem avodah zarah every time they do shehita, for example. That's the discussion over there. In other words, they're not ideologically motivated. They're not religious over the avodah zarah. They're just over the avodah zarah stamp, because that's what everyone does. That's just what you do, without thinking about it very much. A Yisrael Meshumad is someone who thought about it. That's the normal case. Now, one of the examples, at least in the time of Hazal, was that Yisrael Meharel Shabbat Parhesia, but Parhesia is Harehu Kegoy Lechol Devaro, as Rambam writes in Hilchot Shabbat, for example, or Yisrael She'oved Avodah Zarah, Harehu Kegoy Lechol Devaro. These were two activities, Avodah Zarah and Shabbat, that if a Jew knowingly, openly, willingly engaged in these practices of Hilul Shabbat or Avodah Zarah, you know that he has turned his back on Judaism altogether. How has this perhaps changed nowadays? it's not necessarily the case that a Jew who drives his car on Shabbat, Has v'Shalom, has turned his back on Judaism and the Jewish people. How so? Today we see all sorts of strange things all over the world, and even in Israel. You can, but certainly around the world, you can find Jews who go to shul religiously every Shabbat morning by car. Correct? Why do they do that? They obviously do not wish to detach themselves from the Jewish people, but they believe it's mutar to drive a car on Shabbat for this, at least for this purpose, at least for this reason. So for that reason, today it is necessary to be much more open-minded, shall we say, about deciding that a certain Jew is a no doubt a meshumad, because as opposed to, it was a much easier decision to make many generations ago. Today it is not always so straightforward. But if a person loudly proclaims about themselves that they are such a person, well, as it is with our enemies, you should believe what they say. The famous case that took place this past Yom Kippurim, where there was minyan. I think it was in Tel Aviv, but it may have been somewhere else. A minyan, public minyan in an open area, maybe some kind of a park or something. Of course, it was opposed by the Meshumadim, but the court of the Meshumadim, for whatever reason, in this case, decided this would be permitted. And a certain professor, whose name escapes me, and it's not necessary that we know his name, a certain professor, probably extremely intelligent and very highly regarded in his field, from the not from the Technion, I'm sorry, from the Weizmann Institute, showed up deliberately at this minyan tziburi, this open public minyan taking place on Yom Kippurim, with what I would call an ice block or a popsicle or something like that in his hand and in his mouth, and he deliberately is walking around in the crowd of people, deliberately doing this in a very demonstrative and provocative fashion. In that case, you don't need to be particularly perceptive to know that this is a Yisur Meshumat. All right? So we can continue. Halacha Kaf, or Yobheth in some editions. Yisrael shehalach liyarid shel hagoyim. So here we're talking about some kind of a fair. A yarid is a fair, also in modern Hebrew. In other words, some gathering where you have stalls and shops and merchandise. So a Yisrael who is going to such a place, which is a yarid shel goyim, because there might be also yarid shel Yehudim, shel Yisrael, which is going to be hopefully not a problem at all. But if it's a yarid shel goyim, b'hazira asur laset v'lathet imo, you may not transact with him on his return from such a place. Shema avoda Zarah machal lahem sham, because perhaps he sold something connected to, associated with Avoda Zarah to these people. In other words, let's say there's some item that they like to have for some upcoming event, religious festival of theirs, and he knows this and he takes advantage of this and he goes there and he sells it and he makes a nice profit. So he now has Damei Avoda Zarah b'yad Yisrael asurim b'hana'ah. He now has money in his hand, which is derived from, which is the direct result of such a transaction in his possession, and it's a sulba hana'ah, so you cannot transact with him at all. So if he wants to buy something from you now, you can't accept his money. Uviyad hagoy mutarim b'hana'ah, but if it's in the hands of a non-Jew, it is mutar. And so here also we see there's a difference. Sometimes a Jew is more hamur than a goy. As we said before. Okay, so I think that is all fairly clear, and we now continue on to and you should be able to see this now, I think. And I wanted to, I'm not sure I can show you. We've discussed this halakha on various occasions. This halakha and related halakhot. Previously, we discussed how certain halakhot, and more specifically, these kind of halakhot were heavily censored. And I quoted some of the sources to you in the past. For example, let me see if I can quote something which you may not be able to see, but I can quote it to you. Let me just see if I can call up the totally incorrect version, the censored version of the Rambam. Just one moment. For example, at the beginning of this perek that we just finished, I should say, the one we just completed, perek Teth, the correct nusach, of course, is the correct nusach, of course, was Shalosha Yamim Lifnei Dehem Shel Hagoyim. The incorrect version was Shalosha Yamim Lifnei Hagam Shel Ovadei Kochavim. All right, so that's a general kind of deliberate obfuscation of the senses. If you go, however, further in this perek Teth, I'm referring to now again, Halakha Daled, we saw this halakha in the previous shiur. Here, I believe you can see it now. Halakha Daled says, Hanosriim Ovadei Avoda Zarahim, Yom Rishon Yom Edamhu. So having discussed various forms of Avodah Zarah and various festive days, Rambam stresses, as the Talmud stresses explicitly, because the Mishnah, of course, was not yet dealing with necessarily with Christianity, but by a later time when Christianity had further had become more widely accepted and more popular within the Roman Empire, shall we say, for example. So the Talmud specifically speaks about Yom Rishon as being a Yom Ed, for example. And Rambam does the same. Rambam tells us, Hanosreim Avodah Zarahim. The Christians, people who believe, as Rambam says, as we discussed, Rambam says in his Pirush on the Mishnah, anyone who adopts any of the sects or versions of the Christian belief with regards to Otho Ha'ish is Oved Avodah Zarah. Called To'anei Tanat HaMashiach is the Rambam's terminology. Here in the completely censored versions of this halakha, such as Tafus Vilna, I'm not sure you cannot see this right now, perhaps, but I'm reading it to you. Rambam, the nusach is the censored nusach is Kena'anim over there, Kochavim Mazaloth Hem. That's what it says. Kena'anim over there, Kochavim Mazaloth Hem. Yom Rishon Hu Yom Edam. Well, you don't have to be, again, terribly perceptive to understand that this is a very gross and even clumsy type of censorship in order to not have the Christianity referred to and not have the basic elementary truth about it stated. So it's important, of course, to learn and relate only to the correct version of the Rambam. How do we know this is the correct version? With regards to what we just looked at in Perek Teth Halakha Daled, because that is how it appears in all the manuscripts, except for those perhaps that were also censored. Often, with regards to manuscripts, what happened was that they would simply blot out certain words. I have half of the Mishneh Torah, a manuscript that exists in the library of the Jewish community in Amsterdam. I have it on my computer, the second half of the Rambam, and you can see it's a very accurate and very beautiful Kitav Yad from the 13th century, Leminyanam. It's very old and very beautiful and very precise, except when it comes to anything to do with Christianity, of course. And there, everything is literally erased, completely expunged. In some cases, they would take ink and blot out certain words, so you have a black smudge, a black mark. In other cases, they would simply take a knife, like a scalpel, a fine instrument, and shave off a layer of the vellum, of the leather, of the parchment, if we're talking about the parchment manuscript. So I've seen all such things, and I could show you right now, but we won't go into it. This is with regards to Perek Teth. If we now go ahead to Perek Yod, things become even more outlandish, because the Nusach now of Perek Yod, the one we're about to begin, states as follows, and I kid you not. It says, En korathim berith l'shiva amamim, kadesh na'asa imahem shalom, v'noniah hotham la'avod akum. So it says here. So this halacha, according to this heavily censored version, which appears in Tefus Vilna, I think also Tefus Vilna was the first that actually had this nusach. In other words, the censorship became progressively more aggressive and more inane. So you have here halacha that's talking all of a sudden about Shivat Amamim, which has nothing to do with Avoda Zarah. Not that Shivat Amamim in Eretz Canaan, those particular nations specified in the Torah, were not over there Avoda Zarah. They certainly were, as the Torah states numerous times. However, it is a fact that anything to do with Shivat Amamim is discussed in Hilchot Melachim or Milhamot in Perek Hamishi. And for our purposes, there's no difference between those particular Amamim, those 7 nations in Eretz Canaan, in the time of Yoshua bin Nun, shall we say, or subsequent generations, or anybody else, any other Goy or Avoda Zarah. And I have in my possession a certain book of Chidushim of the Rambam. I won't go into it, I won't mention its name, but this person was unfortunately unaware of all these things and begins to explain at great length why this halacha refers to Shivat Amamim and what the halachic reasoning and basis for this is, etc., etc. All of which, of course, is completely spurious, because this is not what Rambam wrote. It's not something Rambam even could have written. And the proof of that, if you need proof, is that in all the accurate versions, even including some of the early printed versions, which I have, such as the first complete printing of Mishneh Torah, Mishnat Resh Mem 1480, which is printed in Rome, next door to the Vatican. Even there, it says En korathim berith l'avoda zarah, as it should say. You should be able to see the text in front of you now. Perek Yod halacha aleph. En korathim berith l'avoda zarah, kadesh na'asa imahem shalom, v'naniach otham l'ovda. We do not reach any kind of treaty or agreement with Goyim over the Avoda Zarah, Kadesh Na'aseh Mahem Shalom is some kind of peace treaty, or which allows them to remain in Eretz Yisrael. That's what we're talking about. And one should always assume that's what the Torah is talking about. In the first place, the Torah is always referring to Jews living in Eretz Yisrael and what should be happening in Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is supposed to be a country which is Avoda Zarah rein, pure and untainted by Avoda Zarah. So if it's in our power to do so, as we will see later in this perek, we are not to make any agreement, we're not to acquiesce to any such arrangement with Goyim over the Avodah Zarah in Eretz Yisrael. Shene'emar lo tichroth lahem berith. Straightforward enough. There the Torah is clearly speaking about, as anyone who looks at that pasuk will immediately discover, is talking about the Goyim in Eretz Yisrael at the time of the Torah, but it applies to anyone who is of the same halachic status. Ela yahsaru me'avodatha or yehorevu. If we are in a position to enforce the Torah, then we tell them, you can either adopt Shiva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, you don't have to convert to Judaism, but you cannot be an Oved Avodah Zarah, which is Asur, for a Ben Noach as well, for a Noahide, for a non-Jew. You can recant any connection to this false belief, which is Asur, or Yehargu, or they are to be put to death. As we discussed, I believe, last time, with regards to Zarah Bar-Hayim, with regards to cutting off the legs of a behemah, shel avodah zarah. We are opposed to Zarah Bar-Hayim, no question. But it is not the highest value, the highest ideal in the Torah. It is in certain situations, such as that one that we mentioned, it is overridden by the need to eradicate Avodah Zarah, to not be involved with or facilitate in any way Avodah Zarah, because Avodah Zarah is the ultimate evil. And as Rambam writes, for example, in Moreh Nevuchim, the major thrust of the Torah, if you look at the myriad mitzvot in the Torah that pertain to these matters, the central thrust of the Torah is to eradicate Avodah Zarah, at least in Eretz Yisrael, and if possible elsewhere, as we shall see. And the same applies to human life as well. Human life is not more important than the eradication of Avodah Zarah, but rather the opposite is the case. And therefore, وَأَصُلَّ رَحِمْ عَلَيْهِمْ, we do not take pity or show mercy to these people. Shene'emar v'lo tehonem. V'lo tehonem is a general miswach lo ta'aseh, a general injunction not to benefit them in any way and not to be positively disposed towards them in any way. In other words, we have to be very focused and even ruthless when it comes to these things. Lefichach, therefore, im ra'a goy oved avodah zarah oved o toveh b'nahar. I want to see what it says in Tfus Vilna here, just one moment. In Tfus Vilna here it says, Im ra'a mehem, and previously it referred to Shivat HaMamim, so we're talking again about Shivat HaMamim. And then, of course, what it says here is that if the person's life is in danger, you do not save them, etc. And that doesn't really square at all with the mitzvah of Ibud Shivat HaMamim as it appears in Hilchot Melachim Milhamot Perek Hamishi. And of course you can understand all the pilpulim and all the discussions that arise from such confusion. But of course, this has nothing to do with Shivat HaMamim, and the correct nusach is here before us. Lefichach imra goy, and the assumption is that a goy is an oved avodah zarah, and that's what Rambam says, oved avodah zarah, because the actual baraitha that Rambam is quoting, it doesn't actually mention oved avodah zarah. It says hagoyim. But the assumption is, as the Ramban writes in Makot Daf Tayet, quoted by others like the Ritba, if the assumption is, unless you know otherwise, a goy is an oved avodah zarah, because that's what everybody does. And again, we don't make unreasonable assumptions, as we see here again. This is another proof of what we said before. We live in the real world, and we make reasonable assumptions, and not far-fetched and outlandish assumptions. So, stam a goy, oved avodah is oved avodah zarah by definition. You see such a person, oved, his life is in a situation where he's about to die. In other words, he may be hanging by his fingernails from a cliff or something, and you can either help him up or you can just ignore him, and he will meet his maker in his own way. Or tovea banahar, or he's drowning, for example, in a river, or it could be in the sea, wherever it is. Well, lo ya'alenu, you should not get involved and save his life. Why? Because this person is hayav mitha. He's a ben maweth. Even if no one bothers to tell him anything about these things, about Shiva Miswot B'nei, that is the fact. And the fact is overrides everything else. This is a person who furthers Avodah Zarah in the world, who associates with, who funds, who by simply being part of such a community or such a people, he's undermining the Torah. And here we're talking, in the first place, we're talking about here within Eretz Yisrael. That's what this halacha is referring to. That we in Eretz Yisrael, if we are in charge, we're able to live according to the Torah without persecution, without being prevented by whether it's the Romans or the Israeli police force or what have you, from acting out all the various mitzvot of the Torah. And then the halacha is simple: lo ya'alenu. You don't do anything. In other words, you don't proactively kill this person, but you don't save his life either, because such a person doesn't belong, should not be in Eretz Yisrael, should not be allowed to exist in Eretz Yisrael, as we just saw before. We don't make any kind of agreement or covenant with people such as this in order to allow them to remain here, as we said at the beginning of the halacha. This person should not be here.
Rabbi?
Just 1 second. Ra'uhu laku'ah lamuth. And therefore, if you see him, this person, such a person, in a situation which places them in danger, lo yasilanu, you should not do anything to save them. This is passive. You are passive. You just don't do anything. Shev wal ta'aseh. As opposed to what? Aval. However, la'abadho biyadho, to do away with this person proactively, or such as pushing him off a cliff or into a pit or something like that where he will die. Asur, that is asur. Why? Because he is not in a state of war with us. In other words, a ben Noah is hayav b'sheva mitzvot, as we've discussed, as Rambam discusses in Hilchot Milchama. If a ben Noah transgresses one of those mitzvot, he's hayav mitah. There is no other punishment for such transgressions, but he has to be brought before a Beth Din, and the facts have to be established according to the halacha. There has to be a witness. It can be a non-Jewish witness in such a case, or what have you. But there has to be some legal procedure, some process. If the facts are established, and this is the case, and this person is hayav mitah, then the Beit Din is required to put him to death, as the Beit Din would do with a Jew who is discovered to have transgressed a mitzvah of the Torah, which might result in mitat Beit Din. Here Rambam is stressing, and in his own words, in very few words, Rambam is very, very economical here with language. This is how Rambam quotes the halacha of Hatov shebaguim harog b'sha'at milchama. He doesn't use that terminology precisely, but he says, you do not actively bring about his demise unless, but if he is in a state of war with us, he and his people. Now, also, how would you know? You're walking along the riverbank and you see obviously some Roman drowning in the water or flailing about and doesn't know apparently how to swim and not doing very well. It seems that he's about to drown. How do you know that he's in a state of war with us? Well, you know because he's a Roman. And the Romans are at war with the Jewish people. That's the reality. You don't have to hand him a questionnaire, a waterproof one, and a waterproof pen, and ask him to fill out the blanks to explain his position on various issues before you decide what to do with him. The fact that he belongs to this group of people with whom we are familiar, who are in a state of war. When I say state of war, they don't have to be actively involved in a battle right now. That goes without saying. Even two Jewish groups, who are in a state of war with each other and on the battlefield, well, then obviously, even though it's a Jew, a fellow Jew, it's a terrible situation, but that would be the halacha. But here we're talking about a general state of animosity, of hatred, of persecution of the Jewish people by this person's nation, by this person's group with whom he is associated, then the halacha of hatov shebagim harog b'shat milchama, which appears in a number of sources, such as Mechilatar de Rabbi Yishmael in Parashat Bo and in Masechet Sofarim. It appears here in the Rambam, and it appears in the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch and about 25 Rishonim, if you want to check, then you will discover that this is one of the least contested halachot in all of Torah Moshe Rabbeinu. So if this person is a danger to the Jewish people by virtue of the fact that he is part of a group that are opposed to the Jewish people, shall we say, people who are trying to uproot the Jewish people from their land, and people who actively persecute them, and who conquer them and occupy their land and attack them and do everything in their power to weaken and persecute the Jewish people and Jewish individuals, then such a person is considered an oyev, and as an oyev, as that's called a sha'at milchama, and then you are not only able to do away with this person proactively, but you're encouraged to do so, if possible. That is the statement that the Rambam makes here. Yes, there was a question.
Yes, to clarify, this din of en ma'alin ve'en moridin, does this
I'm sorry?
En ma'alin ve'en moridin?
Yes.
Does this apply in Chutz La'aretz as well?
Does it apply to?
In Chutz La'aretz?
This halacha is not necessarily for Eretz Yisrael. It applies everywhere. The difference is that normally in Chutz La'aretz we're not in a position to do this for obvious reasons. As we saw, if you recall, I will quote from Perek Teth that we learned previously, without showing it to you right now, but we saw the halacha in Perek Teth halacha Yod Het, Bath Yisrael lo thonik et benah shel hanochrith. A Jewish woman should not act as a wet nurse, should not provide sustenance for the child, a baby, a young child who nurses of a non-Jewish woman. Why? Ben Avoda Zarah, as we said before. Our purpose is to eradicate Avoda Zarah. And here, by so doing, this woman is actively furthering Avoda Zarah in the world. But the Rambam goes on to say, as Chazal say, Aval meyaledet hi b'sachar. But she's allowed to do so if she's being paid to do so, not as a favor, which women often do for each other, but if she's being paid to do so, and the goyim know that she's able to do so. She has a good supply of milk, and she does it for other people. Why wouldn't she do it for us? Mishum eva. If there is a hashash, and there always basically was a hashash in Chutz La'aretz, when the Jews are a small minority amongst a much larger and usually hostile majority, that if they see that you're not well disposed towards them and you refuse to do such a thing for them, they may react violently, as mishum eva, because of increasing or engendering hatred and hostility. Then it's mutar to do certain things. And this would apply, as we said, I think we mentioned in earlier shiur, about the isur of selling arms and weapons to non-Jews. So normally it's asur, but there are extenuating circumstances where it would be required and necessary to do so in order for our own survival. So that halakha that I just quoted about the woman nursing a non-Jewish child is also such an example. That's just one woman, one person perhaps, or one family, we don't know, or one community. If the Jewish people, on the other hand, as a nation, were to refuse and unable to sell munitions and weapon systems to all kinds of people, all kinds of nations, then we simply could not, we would not be able to survive and maintain ourselves and defend ourselves. So, Mishum Eva is a sufficient reason to allow nursing such a child in order to avoid such Eva, because it could lead to shvichut damim even, or other serious outcomes. And therefore, without being specific, we don't know exactly what it will lead to, but it certainly will not improve our situation vis-a-vis these people. We have to take that into account. Now, normally you would hope in Eretz Yisrael this would not be the case, but it was the case, unfortunately, in Eretz Yisrael, not infrequently in many parts of the country. In many cities like Kesaria, Kesarin, there was a Jewish community, quite a large one, but most of the inhabitants were non-Jews, and they were very hostile to the Jews, as we later learned, leading up to the years leading up to the Mered HaGadol that led to the eventual Hurban of Beit Sheni, when the Romans encouraged and turned a blind eye to large-scale attacks by, for example, the non-Jews in Kesarin against the Jews there, and they massacred essentially all the Jews of Kesarin. And there were many such examples, which is another proof, if one requires further proof, that the Romans were our enemies, and all the people associated with them were our enemies, and all the Gentiles in the country view the Jews as enemies because they knew that this was the country of the Jews, and the Jews were not pleased with their presence, and they were happy to be rid of the Jews if possible. So, returning to this halakha, when is this the case? What we just said a moment ago about not saving, not standing aside and not simply observing and not getting involved and allowing this person to meet their fate, whatever it might be. That's talking about a goy, and we assume that he's an Avoda Zarah, and the assumption is a very solid assumption, because 99% of the time that was the case. However, when we're talking about Jews, Aval, Mosarei Yisrael, Wahaminim, Wa'apikorosim, such people, Miswala Abadan Bayad. Here, there is no such Shevval Ta'aseh. Here there is an active inyan and miswa to do away with such people. Luhoridam al be'er shahat. Why? Some people, of course, would immediately begin to clamor that here we have, once again, the Jews like bloodshed and killing and are violent and genocide and whatever it is. I noted, I saw something yesterday, I should mention here, that for some reason we don't hear much about genocide or the killing of innocent civilians in Syria right now, for example. I haven't noticed great demonstrations at Berkeley or at Columbia University or wherever. For some reason it just doesn't seem to register. Interesting point. Nor have we seen people walking around with signs like queers for Syria or something like that. Interestingly, it's interesting to note. So why do we do away with such people wherever possible? Again, in a normal Jewish society, such people would be dealt with by the legal system, by the court system. But here we're not necessarily talking about such a system, or such a reality rather, and therefore this comes down to the individuals very often. And why is this our attitude towards them? Because these people actively work against the Jewish people. In other words, they're enemies. Generally speaking, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about, again, we're clearly going back to our discussion from the previous perek. We're not talking about some Jew who just doesn't know much about Judaism and is not particularly interested in finding out and was brought up in such a place or what have you. We're not talking about that. We're talking about people who are dedicated, people who invest time and energy and money in doing everything they can to fight tooth and nail anything to do with Judaism. And I think we all know exactly the kind of people that we're talking about. They persecute and cause trouble for and bring disaster down on the heads of the Jewish people whenever they can. And they lead people astray away from Hashem and towards whatever woke ideology happens to be fashionable this week. Of course, that would not be mentioned explicitly in any of the censored texts. For example, in Tvos Vilna, if I look here for a moment, what does it say here? The Nusach in Tvos Vilna here is interesting. Aval ha-mosarim apikosim Yisrael. Of course, the halacha in the Tvos Vilna reads as follows: Bamed v'namorim b'shivat hamamim. Obviously, we're talking about the Shivat Hamamim, as we said, which is nonsense. Aval ha-mosarim apikosim Yisrael hayadin. This is now interesting in the past tense. This becomes an historic relic. La'abadam bayad dhuhuridan, etc., etc. Okay. So that, of course, is heavily censored. It goes without saying. What Rambam actually wrote is Mipnei shehem misarim liYisrael o misarim et ha'am me'harei Hashem ke Yeshua hanusri v'talmido. In other words, like the early Christians, all of whom originally were Jews, and then eventually caught on amongst the non-Jews as well. But the original minim were Jews. It was difficult to distinguish and discern such a person from the surrounding Jews in the Beth Knesset who were wearing tefillin just like he was. And you had to look out for certain unique practices, as the Mishneh and Barachot and Megillah states. They choose to daven. They used to, some of them, choose to daven dafka only barefoot, or they used to have, of course, if you asked a person to be the Shliach Tzibur and he had a problem reciting Birkat Haminim, then you have very good grounds to suspect that he is Amin. But he's in the Beth Knesset. He's lichora a Jew like anybody else, but the thing is that he's not. So you have to be savvy and you have to take note of such things. V'sadok uvaithos v'talmidahem shem roshaim yirkav. As we've mentioned also in Bereshit Rabbah, it states that when mentioning the name of the evil, one should add Shem Roshaim Yirkav, and when mentioning the names of the righteous, one should say Zecher Tzadik Livracha, which is part of the same pasuk in Mishneh. So, Stam, a goy who happens to be walking down the street or down next on the riverbank and tumbles into the river and doesn't know how to swim, And there is every reason to assume that he is on Avoda Zarah. You do nothing if you're in a position not to do so. But let's say you know you can be seen by others, by other Romans, shall we say, and they will report this, that you could have saved him very easily and you did not do so. Well, that Mishum Eva, you would be allowed to do so again, because we are at their mercy, unfortunately. That is not how things should be, but that is sometimes how things are. In the case of the internal enemy, we see that the response and the attitude towards the internal enemy is even more severe, as we see in this halakha very plainly, because the internal enemy is like a cancer which eats away at the body politic, the national body of, as it were, of Klal Yisrael. Tov, we shall end here for today. Heyu beruchim, hizku v'yames levavchem kol ha'meyahalim l'Adonai. Shalom u'nisachon al kol oyevenu mibayit u'michutz. Peace and victory, B'ezrat Hashem, over all our enemies, foreign and domestic. Shalom, shalom.